Rodrigo Duterte, the tough-talking mayor of Davao, disappeared without a trace one fateful morning, plunging the nation into chaos. For weeks, the Philippines was gripped by the mystery of his abduction, and when he was finally found, he was not the same man. What had happened to Duterte in those dark, hidden days? What deal had he struck with his captors? The shocking truth behind his kidnapping would forever change the way the country saw its most controversial leader. It was a warm morning in Davao, a city known for its bustling streets and vibrant energy. The sun had just risen, casting a golden hue over the city. People went about their business as usual, unaware that today would mark the beginning of an unimaginable crisis. Rodrigo Duterte, the fiery mayor of Davao and one of the most outspoken figures in Philippine politics, had gone missing. The news spread like wildfire, shocking the nation. How could a man so powerful, so feared, simply vanish? Duterte wasn't just any public official. He was the embodiment of strength and authority in Davao. Known for his no-nonsense stance on crime and his reputation for swift justice, he had become a larger-than-life figure. His popularity was growing, and many viewed him as a potential candidate for higher office in the future. His tough policies had earned him both fierce supporters and bitter enemies, and the city's citizens felt a deep sense of security under his rule. But now, in an instant, all of that seemed to evaporate. He had disappeared, leaving no trace behind. The authorities were thrown into chaos. They had no leads, no demands for ransom, and no sign of foul play. The day Duterte went missing, he had been seen leaving his residence early in the morning, as was his usual routine. He had scheduled meetings with local officials, and there were plans to discuss security improvements for the city. But by mid-morning, Duterte was nowhere to be found. His office tried to contact him, but his phone rang unanswered. His bodyguards, who were usually never far from him, had lost track of him as well. The city was immediately put on high alert. Police, military, and intelligence agencies scrambled to put together a search effort, but the case quickly became more complicated. There was no sign of a struggle, and no one reported seeing anything unusual. It was as if Duterte had simply walked out of his life and vanished. The authorities considered every possibility. Was it a kidnapping, an abduction, or something even more sinister? Rumors began to swirl. Some speculated that Duterte's disappearance was the result of an assassination attempt. With his tough stance on crime and his unflinching rhetoric, it was clear that he had made powerful enemies, both within and outside of government. His stance on corruption and his harsh anti-drug policies had earned him as many detractors as supporters. Could someone have plotted to eliminate him before his influence grew too large? Or was it a political power play, an effort by his rivals to remove him from the picture entirely? Meanwhile, the people of Davao were gripped by fear and uncertainty. They had grown used to Duterte's leadership and his larger-than-life presence. The thought of a city without him was incomprehensible. The streets felt eerily quiet. Locals gathered in groups, whispering theories about what had happened. Was this a warning from the very criminal organizations Duterte had so forcefully opposed? Had they finally succeeded in taking him down? As the hours turned into days, the mystery deepened. The authorities had no solid leads, no ransom demands, and no clear direction. The only thing that was certain was that the disappearance of Rodrigo Duterte was far more than a mere missing persons case. It was a national crisis that threatened to unravel everything Duterte had built in his fight against corruption and crime. The clock was ticking, and with each passing hour, the stakes grew higher. Would they find him? And if they did, would he still be the man he had once been? The world held its breath, waiting for answers. As the days passed and the search for Rodrigo Duterte continued, a sense of unease settled over the entire nation. What had initially seemed like a straightforward case of kidnapping began to reveal deeper, more unsettling layers. The more investigators dug into Duterte's life and political career, the more complex the situation became. There were no ransom demands, no calls from the kidnappers, and no direct clues that pointed to a typical kidnapping scenario. It was as if the very air surrounding his disappearance was thick with mystery. Duterte's rise to power had not been without its controversies. He had long been known for his tough stance on crime and his unorthodox methods in dealing with criminals. His no-nonsense approach had won him praise from his supporters, but it had also made him numerous enemies. Criminal syndicates that had thrived under more lenient administrations found themselves under intense pressure, and Duterte's policies were not just unpopular. They were seen as a threat to the very foundations of their operations. But could someone have gone as far as kidnapping him to put an end to his crusade? At the same time, Duterte had made plenty of enemies in the political arena. His outspoken style and his attacks on corruption within the government had earned him the ire of powerful political figures who viewed him as a threat to their own positions. It didn't take long for investigators to uncover that some of Duterte's rivals had quietly begun to work against him behind the scenes, in the hopes of neutralizing his growing influence. Could one of them have orchestrated the kidnapping? A political power play to remove a rising star who threatened to upset the status quo? A few days into the investigation, a shocking theory emerged. A confidential informant, whose identity remained protected, came forward with a chilling piece of information. The kidnapping was not just the work of criminals or political opponents. According to the informant, a secretive and highly influential criminal syndicate had played a role. This syndicate, which had long operated in the shadows of Philippine politics, was believed to have powerful ties to some of the most corrupt figures in both the government and the business world. The informant claimed that the syndicate had become increasingly worried about Duterte's anti-crime campaigns and his growing political capital. His vision of a crime-free nation threatened their lucrative business, and the syndicate had likely decided that eliminating him was the only way to maintain their control. As the investigators followed this lead, it became clear that the syndicate was not just a group of petty criminals, but an incredibly well-connected and dangerous organization with deep roots in both the underworld and high-ranking political circles. But there were more surprises ahead. The more the authorities uncovered, the more they realized that Duterte's disappearance might not have been purely motivated by the desire to remove him from power. There were signs that whoever was behind the kidnapping had been sending a message, one that was meant not just for Duterte, but for anyone who dared challenge the deep-seated power structures that had long ruled the country. With each new lead, the investigation took unexpected twists. Investigators discovered connections to foreign elements, suggesting that this was not just a local issue, but something that extended beyond the borders of the Philippines. The shadows around Duterte's disappearance grew darker, and the political landscape seemed more treacherous than ever. As the public continued to wait for answers, the sense of urgency among authorities intensified. Time was running out, and the question on everyone's mind remained: who was behind the disappearance of Rodrigo Duterte, and what did they want? The more they uncovered, the more it seemed that the kidnapping was just the beginning of something much larger and far more dangerous. After weeks of relentless searching, the authorities finally received an unexpected tip. A source, claiming to have inside information, pointed them toward a remote island off the coast of Mindanao, far from the public eye. The tip suggested that Duterte was being held there, locked away by a powerful group with both political and criminal ties. The island, isolated and surrounded by treacherous waters, was the perfect hideout for those wishing to keep the mayor under wraps. It seemed almost impossible that anyone could escape such a well-guarded location. And yet, the search was growing desperate. Duterte's disappearance was no longer just a high-profile case. It was now a symbol of the power struggle that was unfolding behind closed doors in the Philippines. The authorities acted quickly, coordinating a secret mission to locate the island. A specialized team of elite officers, along with military and intelligence units, set out under the cover of darkness, determined to find Duterte before it was too late. They navigated through unpredictable waters, avoiding detection at all costs. The island's remote location, known only to a few, made it difficult to pinpoint, but with each passing hour, they closed in on their target. When they finally arrived, the island appeared barren and uninhabited from the outside. The dense foliage and jagged cliffs made it look uninviting, but the team was undeterred. They ventured deep into the island, searching for any sign of human activity. As they pushed forward, they stumbled upon an old, weathered building that stood out against the natural backdrop. It was an abandoned structure, hidden from the casual observer, and it looked as if it had been built for a purpose long forgotten. The compound was well hidden, tucked away in a valley and surrounded by thick jungle. It was the perfect place to imprison someone who needed to stay off the radar. Inside the building, they discovered a network of underground tunnels. These dark, claustrophobic passageways led them to a secret underground compound where Duterte was being held captive. The mayor was alive, but the sight that greeted them was shocking. He was gaunt, his face marked by signs of neglect. His once sharp, commanding eyes seemed distant, as though he had been broken by whatever had happened to him in the weeks since his abduction. Despite his deteriorated condition, there was a strange calm about Duterte as he was freed. The authorities moved swiftly to secure him and remove him from the compound. The mission was a success, but the victory felt hollow. It wasn't just the physical trauma that had altered Duterte. Something in his eyes had changed. His resilience had always been a hallmark of his leadership. But now, there was an unsettling sense of weariness, as if the fire that had once burned so brightly within him had been dimmed by his ordeal. Once, back in Davao, Duterte's condition was assessed by doctors. They confirmed that he had been deprived of food and sleep, and had been kept in near isolation for the duration of his captivity. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, there were no signs of physical abuse. It was as if his captors had wanted him to suffer mentally rather than physically. But there was more to his captivity than mere physical torment. Duterte refused to speak at first, his silence adding another layer of mystery to the already perplexing case. When he did finally speak, his story was strange and unsettling. He revealed that during his time in captivity, he had been in contact with his captors, not as a prisoner but as someone negotiating a deal. The details were vague, but Duterte mentioned that he had made an agreement to secure his release. This revelation left the authorities and the public with even more questions. What kind of deal had Duterte made with his captors? And more importantly, what had he promised in exchange for his freedom? The mystery surrounding his disappearance had only deepened, and the country was left to wonder how much of Duterte's story was the truth, and how much was still hidden in the shadows. As Duterte slowly returned to public life, the Philippines was left grappling with an unsettling truth. The mayor had been rescued, but the manner of his rescue, and the events leading up to it, were shrouded in mystery. There were questions that no one could answer, and even the authorities seemed to be in the dark. Duterte's reluctance to speak about his time in captivity raised even more suspicions. What had really happened during those weeks? What was the deal he had made with his captors, and why was he so tight-lipped about it? These questions festered in the public consciousness as Duterte prepared to address the nation. It wasn't long before he made a public statement, one that shocked many. Duterte revealed that during his time in captivity, he had negotiated with his captors. He didn't go into specifics, but the message was clear. He had agreed to something in exchange for his release. This announcement sent shockwaves through the country. For the first time, people began to wonder if Duterte had made compromises that went against the very ideals he had once championed. He had always been a symbol of strength, of resistance against corruption and crime. Yet here he was, admitting to striking a deal with the very forces that had held him captive. Some people were quick to defend him, arguing that in such extreme circumstances, anyone would have done whatever it took to survive. Duterte, after all, had always been a survivor. His rise to power had been fueled by his ability to outlast the odds, and many believed he had done the same in this case. Perhaps, they reasoned, he had made a temporary compromise to ensure his return and his continued fight against the forces he had always opposed. But others were less forgiving. How could a man who had built his career on anti-corruption rhetoric now be involved in a secret deal with criminals? What had he promised them? What had he given up? Rumors began to swirl, and soon, whispers of a hidden agenda took hold. There were claims that Duterte had promised to stop his anti-crime campaign, at least temporarily, in exchange for his freedom. If true, it would be a devastating blow to his supporters, many of whom had rallied around him precisely because of his tough stance on crime. The very foundation of his political image seemed to be crumbling, and with it, the trust of the people, who had placed their faith in him. For some, the revelation made sense. Duterte had always been a man of pragmatism, willing to make difficult choices if he believed the end just justified the means. Perhaps he had seen this deal as a temporary setback, a way to bide his time while he regained his strength and power. But for others, it was a betrayal. They had believed in his uncompromising approach to governance, and now it seemed that he had compromised for the sake of his own survival. As the weeks went on, Duterte's behavior became more unpredictable. He seemed restless, as though the events of his kidnapping had shaken him to his core. He returned to his usual duties, but the public began to notice a change in his demeanor. His speeches, once fiery and full of conviction, now carried an undertone of uncertainty. There was a growing sense that Duterte was a man conflicted, a man who had been forced to make a deal that weighed heavily on his conscience. The political climate in the country became more tense. Duterte's enemies began to use his secrecy against him, questioning his commitment to his promises and accusing him of compromising with criminals. But Duterte's loyal supporters remained steadfast, pointing to the reality that he had survived a dangerous ordeal and that his return to power was proof of his resilience. Yet, beneath the surface, the question remained: what had Duterte promised in that secret deal? Had he truly compromised his ideals, or was this merely a temporary measure to ensure his eventual victory? The mystery surrounding his kidnapping and the secrets he kept would continue to haunt his presidency, casting a shadow over his leadership that even his most loyal supporters couldn't fully ignore. Months passed since Duterte's return to power, but the questions surrounding his kidnapping and the secret deal he had struck with his captors lingered, unresolved. The public's perception of him had shifted, and although many continued to support him, there was an underlying sense of doubt that had never been there before. His political enemies seized every opportunity to question his motives, suggesting that the once unbreakable leader was now a man who had traded his principles for his life. The whispers only grew louder, and the media relentlessly pursued the story, hoping for a slip-up, a hint of the truth that would confirm their suspicions. Duterte, however, moved forward with an unshaken resolve, but there was a noticeable change in his approach. He became even more unpredictable, often shifting his public positions on key issues. His speeches, while still commanding and filled with his signature bravado, carried a weight that seemed to reflect the inner turmoil he was grappling with. Despite the bravado, the man who had once seemed unbreakable now appeared burdened by the ghosts of his past decisions. As his presidency continued, Duterte sought to reclaim his power, but something had shifted in the political landscape. His allies, once firmly behind him, began to distance themselves. The revelations about his secret negotiations had made them wary, and they could no longer ignore the possibility that Duterte had made compromises that weakened his political capital. Yet, Duterte's most loyal supporters refused to falter. For them, the man who had fought so hard to rid the country of corruption and crime was still a hero. They argued that the deal he had made had been a necessary evil, a temporary step to ensure his return to power and his continued fight against the forces he had always opposed. But the truth was far more complicated. No one, not even Duterte himself, could explain fully what had transpired during the time he was held captive. The details of his captivity and the deal he had made remained sealed, and those closest to him were reluctant to speak out. His advisors and inner circle maintained a sense of loyalty to him, but there was a growing sense that the man who had emerged from captivity was not the same as the one who had been kidnapped. Despite the controversies surrounding his leadership, Duterte refused to back down. He launched a renewed anti-crime campaign, pushing forward with even more aggressive tactics, aiming to prove that he was still the same force to be reckoned with. His enemies, both political and criminal, grew more nervous, sensing that Duterte was more dangerous than ever. But his return to power was tinged with a sense of ambiguity. The public, once so certain of his mission, now watched with uncertainty, unsure of which side of Duterte they would see tomorrow. The most chilling aspect of Duterte's return was the fact that the details of his ordeal remained buried. No one knew the full extent of what had happened during his time in captivity, what had been promised to his captors. Had he truly compromised his values, or was there a deeper strategy at play? The country's political landscape seemed to hover in a state of flux, with Duterte's shadow looming over everything. His supporters clung to the idea that he was playing a long game, biding his time until he could fully implement his vision. His critics, on the other hand, feared that the man who had once fought so hard for the Philippines was now a pawn in a much larger game. In the end, Duterte's story became one of survival, sacrifice, and the murky waters of power. His presidency remained a symbol of both hope and skepticism, a testament to the dangers of ambition and the cost of survival in the cutthroat world of politics. But as time went on, one thing remained clear. The mystery of his kidnapping had changed him. Whether it had made him stronger or weakened him was still up for debate, but there was no doubt that the shadows of that dark chapter would follow him for the rest of his political career. The question of what had truly transpired during those harrowing weeks in captivity would linger in the minds of Filipinos, unanswered, forever shaping their view of the leader who had come back from the dead.